The battlefields of ancient Earth were littered with the remains of fallen soldiers, men and women, warriors who had fought valiantly for their homes, families, and beliefs. But among them, one name stood out: Hannibal Barca. The Carthaginian general had become a legend, not just for his military genius, but for his unyielding will to dominate and destroy. He had crushed armies twice his size, crossed the Alps with elephants, and outsmarted Rome at every turn. Yet, he had never faced humanity's greatest weapon: sheer, unrelenting willpower. In the year 217 BCE, the tide of war had reached a turning point. Hannibal, having defeated countless Roman legions, had set his eyes on the heart of the Republic, Rome itself. No force could stand in his way, or so he thought, but there was one thing he had overlooked, something no strategist or general could ever account for: the human spirit. Captain Marcus Valerius stood on the precipice of the battlefield, the rising sun casting a warm glow over the horizon. His hand gripped the hilt of his gladius, and his heart beat with a rhythm that matched the pounding of the drums of war. Today, Rome would either live or die. There was no middle ground. "You've been training your whole life for this moment," Marcus whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the clamor of soldiers preparing for battle. "This is for your families, for Rome, for humanity." He turned to face his soldiers, the elite Roman legionnaires who had gathered behind him. Their eyes were focused, filled with a quiet, unshakable resolve. They had fought beside him for years, and though they had seen their fair share of death, none of them feared it now. They had a purpose, a cause that transcended fear. Behind them, a mighty Roman legion stretched for miles, their ranks unbroken, their spirits undaunted. The Carthaginian army, led by Hannibal himself, loomed on the other side, a massive force eager for the final destruction of Rome. Marcus could feel the weight of history bearing down on him. The fate of his people hung in the balance, and he knew that, while they might be outnumbered, the Romans had something that Hannibal's army could never understand: unity and the unbreakable bond of their shared humanity. Hannibal stood atop a hill, surveying his troops as they prepared for the final assault. His face was etched with the scars of 1,000 battles, but his eyes still burned with an intensity that could consume nations. He had conquered entire cities, laid waste to legions, and caused the mightiest empire in the world to tremble. But even now, as he looked upon the Romans, he felt something stirring within him, a nagging sense of uncertainty. "I have fought with the best," Hannibal muttered to his trusted lieutenant, Mago, "but these Romans, they are different." Mago nodded, his face grim. "They fight not just for Rome, but for something greater. Perhaps they are ready for this." But Hannibal dismissed it. "No matter their will, Mago, they will fall like all the others." The battle began with the clash of steel, the screams of soldiers filling the air as the two armies collided. Hannibal's war elephants trampled through the front lines, their mighty tusks piercing through armor and flesh alike. His cavalry swept through the flanks, devastating the unprepared. The Roman legions, though outnumbered, held their ground, their formations tight and disciplined. Marcus led from the front, his gladius flashing in the sunlight as he cleaved through enemy soldiers. His mind was sharp, his movements precise. He was no longer a mere man. He was the embodiment of Rome's will to survive. In the heat of battle, Hannibal's personal guard broke through the Roman lines, forcing Marcus and his officers to retreat slightly. The general's eyes locked onto the Roman captain, who had just slain two of his best warriors. A cold smile crossed Hannibal's face. Finally, he murmured, making his way through the chaos, "A worthy opponent." Hours passed, and the battle raged on. The Romans, though outmatched in numbers, refused to give an inch. For every Carthaginian soldier that fell, 10 more Romans stood firm. Hannibal, frustrated, pushed forward, cutting through the Roman ranks with the precision of a scalpel. But as the day wore on, his army began to falter. The Roman formations were holding, the soldiers refusing to break. Finally, it was Marcus who found his way through the chaos, cutting down one of Hannibal's generals. He met the Carthaginian general's eyes from across the field. The two locked in a silent battle of wills, each knowing that the final outcome would be determined by this last confrontation. With a battle cry that shook the earth, Marcus charged, cutting his way through the Carthaginian soldiers. He reached Hannibal's position, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of history pressing down on him. Hannibal smiled, drawing his sword. "You are brave, Roman," he said, his voice cold and calculated. but you will fall like all the others." Marcus did not reply. With a roar, he launched himself at the Carthaginian general. The clash of steel was deafening. The two men locked in a furious dance of violence. Hannibal was a master swordsman, his strikes as sharp and calculated as any Roman legion's tactics. But Marcus was fueled by something more primal, unyielding drive to protect his people. The duel raged on, neither side giving an inch. Blood stained the earth beneath them, and the sounds of battle seemed to fade as the two men fought in deadly silence. Finally, with a swift and brutal move, Marcus found an opening. He thrust his gladius forward, driving it deep into Hannibal's side. The Carthaginian general gasped, his eyes widening in disbelief as his own blood spilled onto the ground. He fell to his knees, his sword slipping from his grasp. You cannot defeat me," Hannibal gasped, his voice weak. Marcus looked down at him, his expression hard as stone. "You underestimated humanity, Hannibal. You thought we could be broken, but we never will be." With a final, decisive blow, Marcus ended the life of the man who had once been the greatest threat to Rome. The battlefield fell silent. As the sun set on the battlefield, the Roman legion stood victorious. The Carthaginian army, leaderless and broken, fled in disarray. Hannibal was dead. The unthinkable had been accomplished. Rome had survived. The battlefield was a scene of quiet devastation, the once boiling chaos now replaced by the stillness of victory. The smoke of battle hung thick in the air, mingling with the scent of blood and death. Rome's legions, weary but resolute, began to regroup, forming ranks and surveying the field. The cries of the wounded mingled with the sounds of footsteps, the heavy footfalls of soldiers moving carefully through the aftermath of the brutal fight. Captain Marcus Valerius stood at the center of it all, his sword now a dull, blood-stained weight in his hand. His armor was battered, and his face was streaked with dirt and sweat. He could barely feel the fatigue in his limbs. Adrenaline still coursed through his veins. Though the battle had ended, he looked out over the fallen Carthaginian forces, his mind replaying the final moments with Hannibal. Though he had struck the death blow, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the victory was not truly his alone. It belonged to the thousands of soldiers who had given their lives in defense of Rome, to the spirit of his people, and to the untold generations who would live to tell the tale of this moment. Hannibal had underestimated them not just as soldiers, but as a force bound by something deeper than mere tactics or strategy. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint cries of the wounded and the groans of men who would never rise again. Marcus's heart ached as he thought of those who had given their all. Yet, his thoughts were interrupted by the sudden presence of his lieutenant, Gaius. "Sir," Gaius said, his voice filled with reverence. He knelt beside Marcus and handed him a parchment, stained with dirt and blood. "It's from the Senate. They've been informed of your victory. They wish to honor you for your bravery." Marcus took the letter but didn't open it right away. His eyes wandered over the battlefield again, lingering on the bodies of his comrades. "This victory belongs to them, not to me," he muttered. "But it was you, sir, who struck down Hannibal," Gaius said, his tone firm but respectful. "You ended the war. You saved Rome." Marcus finally opened the letter, but its contents hardly mattered. He had never sought glory or titles. It had been a fight for survival, for the survival of Rome itself. His fingers traced the seal, and though he acknowledged his duty as a leader of men, he knew this was only the beginning. The Carthaginian threat had been vanquished, but there would always be another battle, another force seeking to challenge humanity's will. "We may have won today," Marcus said, looking out over the field, "but tomorrow is another fight. We must rebuild, honor the fallen, and never forget that we are all part of something greater than ourselves." As the weeks passed, the echoes of victory reverberated across Rome. News of Hannibal's death spread throughout the ancient world like wildfire. The Senate hailed Marcus as a hero, and the citizens of Rome rejoiced in the streets. Statues were erected in his honor, and songs were sung about the man who had struck down the greatest general of the age. But Marcus never let the fame consume him. He returned to his home, a modest villa on the outskirts of the city. There, he spent his days in quiet reflection, surrounded by those who had known him long before he was a hero. He had given everything not for the titles or the accolades, but for the belief that the survival of his people was worth any sacrifice. Yet, even in this peace, there was an undercurrent of tension. Though Hannibal had been defeated, Other powers around the Mediterranean watched Rome's rise with envy. Even the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the emerging powers of the East were cautious, knowing that Rome was not a force to be underestimated. One evening, as the sun set over the Italian countryside, Marcus stood at the edge of his property, looking out over the lands that had been secured by blood and sacrifice. He thought of his fallen comrades and those who would never see the light of another dawn. The winds whispered through the olive trees, carrying the weight of time itself. Humanity will always fight, Marcus said aloud to the winds, his words firm with the knowledge of all he had endured. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, we will stand tall, and if we fall, we will rise again. Far to the south, in the city of Carthage, whispers of Hannibal's death reached the ears of the elders. The Carthaginian general had been the last hope for the city's resurgence, but his fall marked the end of an era. Still, the people of Carthage, though defeated, were not broken. Their defeat by the hands of the Romans did not signal their surrender. In their hearts, they knew that time would come again for them, and they would remember how Rome had struck down their greatest champion. Elsewhere, the world continued to move forward, its currents ever shifting. With humanity at the helm, they had proven, once and for all, that no matter how dark the world became, the spirit of humanity would never be extinguished, and in every battle, in every conflict, they would face the storm with the same resolve they had shown on that fateful day when they had struck down Hannibal. For in the end, it was not just the weapons of war or the might of armies that decided the outcome of history. It was the hearts of men and women, bound together by an unshakable belief in their future, a belief that no one, no matter how great, could ever fully crush. The final blow had been struck, but the story of humanity was far from over. Years passed since the Battle of Zama, where Marcus Valerius struck the final blow to Hannibal Barca. The sun rose and set over the city of Rome, now irrevocably secure in its dominance over the Mediterranean. The victories of Marcus and his soldiers were immortalized in marble statues, temples, and grand celebrations. Yet, the triumph of the human spirit, embodied in that final battle, had not gone unnoticed by the wider world. While Rome's empire expanded ever outward, its borders stretched thin by the ever-growing ambitions of its people. They could not afford to rest on their laurels. The fall of Carthage was still fresh in the minds of its enemies, and while Hannibal's shadow had been vanquished, new challenges loomed. One evening, as Marcus reflected in his study, a messenger appeared at his door, clad in a weathered tunic. The young soldier's eyes were wide with urgency, his breath ragged from travel. "General Valerius," the soldier began, dropping to one knee, "there is news from the Eastern Front. The Gauls have risen again, and rumors abound that they have allied with the Greeks. They are gathering armies, with new weapons, new strategies. The Senate calls for your return." Marcus felt a sudden weight in his chest, the ghost of old memories rising. He had fought for Rome in so many wars, yet a part of him still longed for the days when he could simply exist outside of battle. But duty called, and he would answer. "I will leave at once," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "Prepare my horse." Days later, the legions of Rome once again stood at the gates of a new challenge. The Eastern Gauls, led by a fierce new chieftain named Brennus, had raised an army large enough to pose a real threat to the Roman provinces. Their alliance with the Greeks, particularly the fractured remnants of Alexander's empire, further complicated matters. These were not the same tribes Rome had crushed before. These were people with new tactics, new weaponry, and a hatred of Rome's growing power. At the front lines, Marcus stood once again, gazing over the thousands of troops who had come to his command. They had already seen battle, and many had fallen in previous campaigns, but like the Romans of old, they stood united, their resolve unshakable. Though the odds were once again stacked against them, they knew what the outcome must be. Rome would not be defeated. "The enemy is strong, but they lack what we have," Marcus said, addressing his officers. "They may have numbers, they may have new weapons, but we have something they do not. We have the will of Rome. We have unity. We will fight for our children, for our future, and for the survival of everything we've built." His words were simple, but they struck a chord with his soldiers. There was no grandeur in his speech, no promises of easy victories. It was raw truth that resonated with them. They fought not for glory or riches, but for something far greater than the enduring legacy of their people. As the two armies lined up across from each other, The sounds of war drums echoed across the field. The enemy's numbers were staggering, their weapons glinting in the sun, but Marcus had faced down armies larger than this before. It was not the size of the force that mattered, it was how that force was wielded. The first wave of Gauls rushed forward, their battle cries filling the air, swords and spears raised high. They were fierce, savage, and full of the kind of fury that could break lesser armies. But the Romans, standing firm in their disciplined ranks, held their ground. Their shields formed an impenetrable wall, their spears thrusting with deadly precision. The Gauls' wild assaults began to falter against the Roman formations, their numbers thinning with every passing minute. 4 hours, the battle raged. Marcus fought alongside his soldiers, his gladius flashing in the sunlight. He felt the same adrenaline as before, but there was something different this time. The Romans were no longer fighting for survival alone, they were fighting for the future of every generation to come. They were fighting for the very ideals of their civilization, order, justice, and perseverance. Finally, as the Gauls began to retreat, Marcus saw the opportunity. The Greek forces, still positioned on the flanks, have remained a constant threat, using advanced tactics and cavalry to harass the Roman lines. But they, too, began to falter under the relentless pressure. Marcus gave the signal, and the Roman cavalry surged forward, cutting through the remnants of the Greek alliance with precision. Amidst the chaos, Marcus spotted Brennos, the leader of the Gauls, rallying his troops for one final stand. The chieftain was a towering figure, his long hair matted with blood, his eyes burning with defiance. Marcus knew this battle would not end until Brennos was defeated. He rallied his own cavalry and charged into the heart of the Gaulish formation, determined to meet the chieftain in battle. Brennos saw him coming, and with a guttural cry, he met Marcus in the center of the battlefield. The two leaders clashed, their swords ringing with the force of their blows. Brennos was strong, his ferocity unmatched, but Marcus's experience and unshakable will gave him the edge. They fought fiercely, neither willing to give an inch. Finally, with a swift and well-timed strike, Marcus disarmed Brennos and brought him to the ground. The battle around them began to slow as the remaining Gaulish forces, seeing their leaders fall, began to retreat in disarray. The Romans had won once again. In the days that followed, Marcus stood amidst the ruins of the battlefield. The air was thick with the smoke of the fires that had consumed the enemy's camp, and the once proud Gaulish banners now lay trampled in the dirt. His soldiers celebrated, but Marcus knew that the war was never truly over. For every victory, there would be another challenge. Yet, as he looked over the exhausted but victorious men and women who had fought beside him, he felt an undeniable pride. They had faced down impossible odds once again, and they had emerged victorious. And in that moment, Marcus understood the truth of what had made Rome indomitable. It was not simply the strength of the armies, nor the brilliance of its generals. It was the unyielding determination of the people of humanity itself that could never be broken. Rome had survived the might of Hannibal, and now it had triumphed against the Gauls and the Greeks. But there would always be new enemies, new forces that would rise to challenge the might of humanity. In the years following the victory over Brennos and the Gauls, the echoes of Rome's triumph spread far and wide. The empire, though battered by continuous conflict, had proved once again its resilience. The Senate, having watched its citizens, soldiers, and leaders rise above each challenge, saw the inevitable truth. Rome had become an unstoppable force not merely through military power, but through the unwavering conviction of its people. Marcus Valerius, once a hero celebrated in marble, was now a seasoned leader, still dedicated to the Roman ideals of unity, justice, and progress. But as Rome's influence spread further, so too did the tensions in the regions it had conquered. The further borders of the empire, stretched thin and constantly vulnerable, faced unrest from local tribes and distant enemies. For Marcus, it was clear the challenges ahead would be even greater, but the spirit of humanity, of the Romans, would carry them forward. It was in the year 183 BCE that a shadow loomed over the empire from an unexpected direction. While the Senate had long been focused on the borders of Gaul and Greece, a new threat emerged from the east, a coalition of tribes, kingdoms, and empires previously seen as fractured and isolated. The Persian Empire, though weakened by years of internal strife, have risen under a charismatic and brutal leader known only as Ardashir, who had united the East with a single purpose, the destruction of Rome. At the head of this new alliance, Ardashir was not just a warlord, but a visionary. He saw in Rome a rival too powerful to exist in the world. With his growing forces, he was prepared to wage a war that would rival any Rome had ever faced. His message was clear: Rome must fall. And as word of this new eastern threat reached Marcus's ears, he knew there would be no avoiding it. Ardashir, Marcus muttered as he read the reports from scouts, his face set in grim resolve. Another man with a vision of domination, but he does not understand the truth of our people. The truth that no man, no empire, can stand against the will of humanity united. He turned to his trusted council of generals and advisors. Prepare the legions, he ordered. We march east. Weeks later, Marcus and his legions stood at the borders of the eastern territories, gazing at the vast, untamed lands that stretched before them. The Persian Empire, once a shadow of its former glory, had now been reborn through Ardashir's brutal vision. The cities along the border were in chaos, as local kings and tribes, torn between loyalty to Rome and the rising power of the East, struggled to choose sides. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the weight of uncertainty. The enemy's numbers were vast, and Ardashir's reputation for brutality had already struck fear into many of the weaker states. But Marcus, like every Roman soldier, knew that fear was a weapon only as strong as those who wielded it, and Romans did not bow to fear. The Roman legions were an imposing sight as they crossed the frontier into the east, their banners fluttering like the wings of an unstoppable storm. As they marched, Marcus knew the challenge ahead would be different. The Persian armies, unlike the Gauls and Greeks, fought with a different kind of strategy, one that depended on quick strikes, heavy cavalry, and fire-wielding siege tactics. But Rome, too, had evolved over the years. Marcus had ensured that their forces had adapted. Learning from their past victories and defeats, the legions were stronger, faster, and more versatile than ever before. The time for passive defense was over. The time to strike had arrived. The first battle with Ardashir's forces occurred just outside the ancient city of Persepolis. The land was barren, cracked from years of drought, and yet the very earth seemed to tremble with the approach of two great armies. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the enemy lines, his mind racing with strategy. Ardashir's forces had entrenched themselves well, using the natural terrain to their advantage, with massive war elephants forming the vanguard of their charge. The Persian king stood proudly on a raised platform, watching the Romans approach. His face was calm, his posture regal. He had gathered an alliance of thousands, all united in their shared desire to see the fall of Rome. Your ambition will be your downfall, Ardashir, Marcus murmured to himself. No empire ever lasts forever, especially one built on fear. The Roman battle formations, honed through decades of experience, took shape. The first phase of the battle began with a cavalry charge, Roman cavalry clashing with Ardashir's horsemen in a flurry of hooves and steel. The ground shook beneath the weight of their galloping forces, but the Romans fought with an intensity born of survival, each legionnaire knowing the stakes were higher than ever. As the Persian war elephants thundered forward, Marcus made his move. He signaled to his archers, who unleashed a rain of arrows, striking down the elephants with precision. The massive beasts screamed in agony as they fell, creating chaos among the Persian ranks. But it wasn't enough to break the eastern force. Ardashir's warriors were relentless, pushing back the Romans with the fury of men desperate to protect their new empire. Marcus knew the only way to end this was to face Ardashir himself. With his elite cohort, he pushed through the battlefield, cutting down Persian soldiers as they made their way toward the platform where the Persian king stood. The final confrontation between Marcus and Ardashir was one of blood, sweat, and sheer willpower. The two leaders, each representing the vision of their respective civilizations, met in a clash of steel that would decide the fate of the battle. Ardashir's strength was formidable, and his strikes were powerful. But Marcus had something he lacked, the conviction of a people who had fought for survival for centuries. With a final, brutal blow, Marcus pierced Ardashir's armor and struck him down. The Persian king fell, his forces collapsing around him as his army, leaderless, faltered. The remaining Persian soldiers fled in disarray, and the Romans, victorious once again, pressed forward, securing the region. In the aftermath of the battle, the dust settled over the plains of Persepolis. Marcus stood over the fallen Persian king, his breath ragged, his body aching. The battle had been won, but at what cost? Thousands of soldiers, on both sides, had lost their lives in the struggle. Yet, in the end, humanity had triumphed once more.